Hello, this is the second part of the auditory central nervous system. In the previous part, we spoke briefly about the auditory system in general, the peripheral component, and the central or the auditory central nervous system part. Now we continue the discussion from the midbrain. What happens in the midbrain? And then going up to the cortical areas. And after that, we speak about, we connect the information with the early years of development, the critical stage, the critical periods, and we see how sound stimulation connects with speech and speech production. The midbrain here, as I explained previously, consists of three areas. The medulla oblongata, that lower part, and that continues with the spinal cord below it. And so the medulla, and then the pons is the second part that sits on top of the medulla. And then on top of that, we have the midbrain, this area here. You can see, basically, the midbrain is continuous with the medulla, and the pons kind of goes around and hugs that part of the brainstem. You could see this piece that is cut, that's part of the pons, is basically one of the arms of the cerebellum that sits in back of the head. And so that area, the pons, connects the cerebellum with the rest of the brain. But we don't have to go too much into the anatomy component. I just wanted to highlight some areas here. So looking at the midbrain, that greenish kind of area here, you find this little component that's called the inferior colliculus here. On top of it, there are two structures. The superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is part of the midbrain. So you can look on the right here. You can see if you split this brainstem into two pieces, you will find that the right side is exactly identical with the left. So there's one inferior colliculus here, and on the other side, you have a mirror image of it. On top of the inferior colliculus, two of them are colliculi. You have the superior colliculus, one right, one left. So, as the signal comes from lower areas, from the cochlear nuclei, actually they are here at the junction between the medulla and the pons, around here. So the cochlear nuclei give rise to pathways. First, these pathways cross to the opposite side, rise, and there are four pathways on the right and two pathways on the left for each ear. So all of this input from these pathways here, all these inputs converge onto the inferior colliculus. And I told you that every step of the way, every station the sound passes through, it will be processed in a certain way, and that component, that station, adds or processes the information in terms of a certain thing that it looks for. So, for example, one area looks for the frequency, the pitch of the sound, and the sound wave. One area looks at the timing between right ear, left ear. One area looks at the horizontal scanning, loudness, intensity. So all of this information, by the time it all converges onto the inferior colliculus, now that central area of auditory processing, it now integrates all the inputs from both ears, left and right, and from all pathways. And now it has the information for the auditory signal in every aspect of the way. In terms of the sound localization piece, at this point in time, this area takes all this information. Now it is able to see it is able to identify and pinpoint the sound with laser accuracy. So horizontally and vertically, and when you cross them, you have one focal point. Then what do we do with this information? The inferior colliculus has 4 pathways, and it sends the information to all these pathways at once. But while we are here, I wanted to point out one of the major stations that the sound goes through. See this is the thalamus. And here is another view of it, lateral view. Beneath, on the lower part of the thalamus, there's a little area that's bulging. It's by itself, it's a structure that is known functionally as the auditory thalamus. This area here is the medial geniculate body. That's the anatomic name of it. And here again. And functionally, what does it do? It is that part of the thalamus that processes sound. So this is why another name for it is the auditory thalamus. So the sound signals go from the inferior colliculus to the superior colliculus, and at once, at the same time, to the medial geniculate body. And also, one pathway from here goes right to the auditory cortex on the cerebral cortex here, on top of the ears. And another pathway goes to different structures around the brain that we know as the association cortices, where vision and hearing and planning are all integrated through these pathways. So let's look and kind of, the plan is not to go too deep into the anatomy, but it is to give you some kind of a comprehensive yet abbreviated description of how the process of auditory transduction or auditory processing goes. So here again, the inferior colliculi, superior colliculi, and they have the medial geniculate body, and the auditory cortex will be somewhere here on the left. So the inferior colliculus again has these 4 paths. It receives input from all the pathways beneath it that are coming, and everything, all the information converges onto the inferior colliculus. And as I mentioned, it sends its input to 4 different pathways, one to the superior colliculus, one to the medial geniculate body, one to the primary cortex itself, and one to the association cortices. But let's see what go back here. What the superior colliculus does with the information. Since we know that the inferior colliculus is dedicated solely to hearing, and then we should understand that the superior colliculus that is dedicated to vision and the integration of hearing with vision. So it integrates auditory signals that we hear with visual functions. This way, imagine yourself, say, in the forest, and you hear a shuffle in some leaves next to you, some disturbance. Things are quiet, but all of a sudden you hear just that rustle in the leaves. Immediately, you are going to localize it. Is it coming from your right side, your left side, behind you, in front of you? And immediately you are going to turn your head and your eye gaze toward the sound source. And the structure that enables you to integrate what you hear with directing your eye gaze and your face toward the source of the sound, that is the superior colliculus. So it enables us to have that auditory visual reflex, or the visual auditory reflex, whatever you call it. A reflex is some kind of action that you perform without thinking. It's an automatic, most often, kind of life-preserving function, or function that is mediated directly by the brainstem or by the spinal cord itself. It doesn't require deliberate thought. Because again, deliberate thought takes more time to process. But this one, if it's you hear a sound, you immediately turn your head. If you say hear a car coming in your somewhere, you can't afford to go, kind of send the order, the command or the information upstairs to the cerebral cord and then think and back and forth and process. No, that is a life-preserving function. Then, the primary auditory cortex itself, which is, see, this is the temporal cortex. The bone that covers this side of the head is called the temporal bone. And this area of the head is called the temple. So, there are three gyri: the superior temporal gyrus, the medial temporal gyrus, the inferior temporal gyrus. That these make up the temporal lobe. Now, take this and enlarge it, the superior temporal gyrus, enlarge it, and this is what you get. This blue area and this pink area. And we are looking at the center, the central part of the superior temporal gyrus. In terms of function, the blue area is called area or Brodmann area number 41. And also it's called area A1. From the anterior, from the frontal part of it to the back of it, so this is anterior, this is caudal or posterior. If you go from front to back systematically, you are going to find that every little segment of it is going to be specialized in a particular kind of set of frequencies. So you begin here. This area is going to process 20 or 25 hertz. This area will process higher and higher and higher and higher pitch levels until, for example, here 500, you go back 1000, and then you keep going all the way to 20,000 hertz. Now you remember this sequence. That is the exact same sequence from the cochlea. So you can imagine now, you can understand now that the top, the hair cells on top of the cochlea that have that are specialized in processing 20 hertz tones and 25 hertz tones and so on, they are terminating finally here. And then the middle part of the cochlea is sending its input to the middle part of the auditory cortex, and then the posterior. So that is the exactly same organization, because you have the same cables coming from below, from the cochlea all the way and terminating over here. The structure of the auditory cortex, again, is tonotopically organized. When you look at it and enlarge it and look at the actual neurons and the structures, it is like columns, like a power grid that has, particular columns and columns and columns organized. And each, column is specialized in a set of frequencies. So these this blue area, the primary auditory cortex, that is the core area of the auditory cortex. And the other piece here, the pink area, that is kind of, we call it the belt area that is surrounding the auditory cortex. I mean, the core area. So the whole thing here, the blue and the pink are the auditory cortex. We call it the primary auditory cortex. But the central piece of it, the blue area that has the map, is the core area. And then the other part is the belt area. So the blue area is specialized in processing harmonic tones and musical tones and kind of things that have a rhythm, that have a pattern, that are pure tones. We call that pure tones. They are sharp and focused. And the belt areas are specialized in mixed tones that are the product of a whole mixture of different waves and different sounds together, bunched up like noises and things that are not as pure. So that is, each area is specialized in a certain kind of. So that tonotopic organization, that map, how things are connecting, that is formed early in childhood. And the critical periods that we spoke about is, when if the person hears sounds and words and, different kinds of sounds, they process, and as they get this system firing in different parts of it along the cortex firing, then it is going to connect well. It will connect correctly. And if the person doesn't get the right stimulation or doesn't get enough stimulation, that map will be altered, will not connect appropriately. And based on that, you can really look back and trace a lot of the auditory processing problems that happen, that children and adults have. You can trace it to this area. But there are some very good things that we need to know that are really promising about this area and about the neuroplasticity in this area. So the tonotopic organization of this map, how it is, every single piece of it, every single neuron in here has to be stimulated by a particular kind of frequency. And if it doesn't receive that stimulation, it is going to be less focused on that frequency that it really is specialized in. And it is going to listen to the noises that are supposed to be coming to the other areas that are surrounding it like a belt. It will be like someone sitting there. They are supposed to have a job to do, and then they are distracted. And as they get distracted, they look around and they just, reach out to touch things and to hold things and they do everything else, but not their job. So you can imagine now what happens when someone has auditory distractions and there is auditory attention. And so all of these things are going to explain to us why someone's attention is not focused when they, for example, are not processing things well, or when there are noises around. And you must have an ability in there to control your attention to noises. So if you are in the cafeteria or you are in a party and the situation, there's so much noise and someone is speaking with you, you should have the ability to focus your auditory attention to what the person is saying and ignore all the irrelevant noises that are surrounding you. So if someone doesn't have the correct mapping and layout of this tonotopic map, they will not be able to process sounds and noise. And mostly, even if there's no noise, they will have difficulty processing sounds. So the tonotopic map is shaped by, it is connected through the specific types of frequencies that the different parts of it receives. As I explained, all this, it has columns, and these columns are made out of different neurons that are similar in function, and they specialize in a particular frequency. And if every single, you need to hear all these different frequencies so that every time you hear them, you make these same neurons fire and fire. The more they fire, the better connected they will be, and the more efficient they will be at firing, and the faster they will be, the more automatic that they will be, firing. What does that mean? It means that you hear something and immediately understand it, immediately make sense of it, immediately connect it with your perceptual system, with your memory, with your attention mechanisms, and with your verbal output, and immediately you're going to be able to process quickly and give a response quickly, whether you think of it or you actually say it. So also the level, so it is the specific type. Every frequency has to be primed, has to be, provided to activate the neurons that specialize in it, and the level, how much, and the nature of the auditory stimulation. These are also critical in making the map connect, the auditory map connect and in the right way. So what happens when there's auditory deprivation? What happens when someone does not have the environment where they hear lots of words and lots of sounds and lots of reading and enrichment and all of that? What happens? What happens when someone they have what is needed, but there are problems here that obstruct the sound and make it not go through accurately or at all to the cochlea, to the brain to be processed? What happens? So all of that is auditory deprivation if there are obstructions that are caused and prevent the sound from going fully or enough to the brain. Auditory deprivation, of course, will happen as a result of hearing loss. As I mentioned, either conductive and or sensorineural hearing loss, or by lack of language that they don't have enough. For example, they don't speak much in the day or night. They don't communicate much with people. They don't hear lots and lots of language around them. That is a kind of auditory deprivation. So when under these conditions, under these circumstances, the auditory cortex, the core area of the auditory cortex, A1, the neurons in it that are specialized in a particular frequency or a particular pitch, they then learn to respond to pitches that are not their own. In other words, they will be distracted by other sounds around them, and they will pay attention to these sounds, and they are not processing the particular tones that require to be processed. So in that case, of course, that will cause decreased auditory attention, and it's going to affect auditory processing abilities. So the people who are raised in unusual sound environments, the cortical map, the auditory cortex itself, is going to be altered. It will not connect correctly. So in these environments, unusual environments, for example, we mean either they have no adequate auditory stimulation, they don't hear sounds frequently or language and so on, or the one, for example, that doesn't have sound stimulation. So, I mean, completely. Say, for example, a child who is verbal, and the child is able to hear, but living with deaf parents who do not use verbal language and has more exposure with deaf people than with verbal people. That person will not be able to develop to connect the auditory map so that they can speak verbally and produce language. So that, depending on how severe the deprivation is, that is going to produce long-term disruptions that will produce long-term impacts. So the areas, as I mentioned, the areas that surround area A1, or the core of the auditory cortex, these are they have two pathways. And I'm just highlighting this because I want to connect it, hearing to speaking. So one pathway, basically ventral anterior pathway. So imagine this is the superior temporal cortex. The top of it here is called the dorsal area. The bottom of it is called the ventral area, like the belly of it. And so there's a ventral anterior pathway. So here is again, the gyrus. And this is the top of it, dorsal and ventral. So the anterior part of it and the ventral, there's a pathway from here to the frontal part of the brain. And the dorsal part, the back of it, there's a pathway from there also to the frontal part of the brain. Why is that important? So here we have, there's a pathway, again, A1, there's a pathway that goes to the frontal lobe here, and there's a pathway that goes to the frontal lobe again. So, and you notice an arrow here. My goal is not to get you bogged down into anatomic details, but I would like you to have an idea about how speech and language are processed in the brain. In case you are interested, in case you need to know more, that could be a beginning. So let's see, for example, at this point, someone hears a sound, or someone asks you a question, for example. Finally, eventually, it will come over here to the area A1, the core of the primary auditory cortex. Next to this area, there's another area here in the back that is called Wernicke's area. And in the middle here, there's an area called the auditory association cortex. And association means linking things together. Behind, on the other side, so here's the auditory association cortex. If you go inside on the other side, you are going to have the memory center, the hippocampus. So now, the sound comes in, and it goes to the core area and the surrounding areas at once. But the sound, a word like cat, it comes as ka, a, t. It doesn't come as like a whole word. So it gets assembled here. And then you have sounds, you have a word that you do not know the meaning for. So the auditory association cortex works with the memory center to bring the meaning, to say, do you know what what this means, cat? And it tells you now, it communicates, the memory center brings the information from all over the cortex about what a cat is, what it looks like, how it feels when you touch it, what color, and all of these properties that have to do with the concept. And that is sent finally to an area here, to Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is where you have these two pathways. It's a pathway in just one, but it passes through the parietal cortex here, around the green area. That green area integrates vision and touch, tactile movement and sensation. So that is the area called angular gyrus. It's very important for reading and writing and so on. So now, and this pathway goes over here to that red area, that is for sensory. It gives you sensation again. So you hear the word, say cat, and you want to know what it feels like to touch a cat. What is it soft? Is it this? Is it that? And then that part also gives you information because it connects with vision. And then you take all of this information and then you send it to the front. This blue area is called Broca's area. That is the area for speech programming, for syntax, for grammar, and for lexicon. So you take words and assemble them into sentences, string them into sentences, and know what is a noun, what is a verb, what is an adjective, an adverb, and so on. And then this brownish area here, or sand color area here, that is your primary motor cortex. It has a map that controls every movable part in the body. And the part that is across from the blue area here, this part, that controls the face, including the lips, and then the neck, and the swallowing, and everything that has to do with the head is in this area. The blue area, the brown area here, has an identical map, but that map doesn't move things, it gives you sensations. For example, let's go back to the primary motor cortex, the lower part. Let's say the part that enables us to move the lips. As you move the lips and say, ooh, now, even if you are closing your eyes, you feel your lips rounded and protruded forward. What gives you that feeling is the area on the right side that is across on the right side. That gives you the sensation from your lips. It tells you they are rounded, they are protruded, the movement is painful. Something cold is touching your lips as you do it, this, that. It gives you all sensory information about whatever organ that you are moving. So, and now you heard the word, or you heard the question. You integrated it with your memory, with your knowledge, with your sensations, with your all kinds of things, and now you have a complete concept, and you send it forward to the to the prefrontal cortex. Here, the prefrontal cortex is here, and it has extensive connections with this area, with Broca's area. Now you decide, what am I going to do about this question? Should I be quiet? Should I answer? And all of this. And the prefrontal cortex here, right behind your forehead, will tell this area, Broca's area, what to do. Oh, I can answer the question, or I should be quiet, and so on. So once the command, you decide to speak, to say an answer, then Broca's area will activate this area. It works with many other areas, but it will activate the speech organs and the muscles, and it will make you able to speak. It's a very complex process, but I just summarized it in a nutshell so that you have an idea about how hearing is connected with speaking and the different structures that control language and hearing in the brain. And as you notice, whenever we do that, we look at the left side of the brain, because Broca's area only exists on the left side. Wernicke's area only exists on the left side. So these are the basic language centers. On the other side, we're going to speak more about this, but on the other side, we spoke more. We process more of holistic things about language. Okay. So, again, we understand that the auditory system is connected with the verbal system because you need to learn to hear well and to process well so that you learn how to, to speak. So the superior colliculus, again, enables us to have the auditory visual reflex to immediately turn our heads and our eye gaze toward the sound source. Now, there is another connection, another pathway that connects the medial geniculate, that is part of the thalamus, with the amygdala. The amygdala is not showing here, but if you go back to some of the previous slides, presentations in the class, we discussed that. So let's go back here. The inferior colliculus, medial geniculate body, and around it, very near, next to it, there will be the basal ganglia, and part of the basal ganglia, next to them is the amygdala and the hippocampus, right in the vicinity here. So the medial geniculate body has a pathway that connects directly, immediately with the amygdala. The amygdala is our fear processing center. So you hear the sound and immediately send it, and you want the amygdala to deploy your alertness and your fear response. Finally, you want the adrenal cortex to produce adrenaline or epinephrine, and you want the blood pressure to rise, and you want the fear response, the stress response needs to be deployed when you hear a sound like this. And immediately the auditory visual reflex is going to be also activated. That is in very quick kind of action that is needed so that you connect your emotional system with your auditory system. Now, there's another pathway that connects the primary auditory cortex itself with the amygdala as well. But that involves more of deliberate thought. That is not a reflex. Now, that is more of a, for example, you hear a sound and you kind of are interested and wait and look and deliberate and, what is this sound come from? And, you kind of plan more and find ways so that you can think and deliberate. So you have time. So in these cases, when there is fear associated with the sound, and there's also time to respond, and the fear response, the fear response is a complex one. It requires planning and deliberate action. Then the primary auditory cortex itself is involved, is directing that. This is just an enlarged, this is an image of the one thalamus, and see how it is divided into different stations. But this is the medial geniculate body that is here. That is the auditory area of the thalamus, and then that is connected with the higher areas of the brain, the primary auditory cortex, area 41 and area 42 around it. So that area 41 or A1, and the areas around it, the particularly area 41, it has pathways that project from it, originate there, and go down to different stations, different levels of the auditory pathways, way down to the cochlea. So the purpose of these pathways, and they're highlighted usually in blue as they come down, the purpose of that is to control the input that is coming to it. It's like, say, you are the CEO of a company, and you sit there and kind of different kinds of information is coming, to you every hour. The phone is ringing every minute. The email is sending an email, and all of this. So maybe there are not enough emails coming in. So just communicate with the person or the people who are sending these emails. I am not hearing enough about what's going on. Could you please give me an update every hour instead of every, couple of hours? Or they are sending too much information. Send down and say, could you please decrease the amount of information? So it regulates the information that is being sent to it. It tells the lower structures what kind of information and what level, of loudness, for example, what level of amplification and so on should be coming in. So it communicates with the medial geniculate of the thalamus, with the inferior colliculus, with the olivocochlear nucleus, with all the major levels major stations along the auditory pathways. And it basically regulates how they do their input and how loud the sound should be. If the sound is compromised or weak, and there's a need for more amplification, or there's a lot of noise, then it gives the clue, it tells these areas to muffle noises and to sharpen the sound that is coming, and so on. So to enhance performance. So we'll speak a little bit about neural plasticity of the auditory central nervous system and what it means when we look at this within the context of the critical periods and sound learning. So the auditory central nervous system, again, is one of the most plastic neural systems. That means it is very flexible, and it continues to be flexible throughout life, and it has a high level of plasticity. So plasticity is naturally at the highest level during childhood, but it decreases gradually with age. That is in normal situations when someone receives normal stimulation, enough auditory stimulation, and they are developing adequately in terms of hearing. So their auditory system connects, and it becomes less and less flexible as they grow. That is the normal situation. However, when someone didn't have enough stimulation during the critical stages and the early childhood years for any reason, the system remains more flexible. It is as if it is waiting for that stimulation to occur so that the system can connect, can complete its connection. So in addition, when someone is motivated and pays attention, they will enhance the auditory neural plasticity even more. For example, any adult, any one of us, now you do not commute. Or when you commute, you don't listen to the radio. And let's say you change jobs and then you sit in the car, you have to travel for 1 hour commuting and you are bored and all of this, what do I do? So you put the radio on, or you get a CD or some kind of, and you listen. And every day you do this twice a day. You notice that your auditory system becomes, works faster and processes faster. And, for example, you would prefer at some point, you might prefer that you have someone read something to you or read information than actually read the information. And if you are more using your visual system and reading lots and lots of things, and then you are not using your hearing as much, then that sense is going to be strong, and then you rely more on it. So the idea of a visual learner and an auditory learner, and all, these are myths. You can be a visual learner for a period of time, and you can change it, you can be adapted. You can become an auditory learner for a period of time, depending on what you get used to. If you aren't an auditory learner at this point and you start to have the experience and you listen more and more and more and more, you build that and you become an auditory learner. You stop using the auditory system as frequently, then you decrease the activity of it. So it is a system that you can adapt, you can change and modify either up or down in any different way that you want. But what we want to avoid is putting people in blocks and just saying, okay, here you are an auditory learner, you are a visual learner. Yeah. No, it's actually, these things do change, and people can use a combination and so on. So, motivation and attention. If there's some, for example, there are programs like Brain HQ or Aerobics that do auditory training. And there are many other programs there that have been proven to be very effective and to actually change the auditory maps and make them more robustly connected and more effective in processing. And that it indirectly enhances reading skills and comprehension skills and attention skills and a whole group of skills that depend on the auditory system. So if you just get connected to one of these programs and listen and go through the program, it will, because you are motivated and you look for certain tones and you kind of choose this and choose that, and you pay attention and you go through the trainings. That is going to enable you to reprogram your auditory system. And like I said, the greatest improvement is noticed in people who have who have effects of auditory deprivation, or people who haven't been experiencing the sounds enough. So they show the most robust improvement. So the sensitive periods, if someone doesn't get the auditory stimulation that is enough for them to develop sound representations in their brains and to develop representations of concepts and words and grammatical forms, then that is going to leave an impact, a long-lasting impact on their nervous system and their auditory system. And we see these as central auditory processing problems. And the reason that a diagnosis like central auditory processing is not made officially, it is not in the books yet, is that it hasn't been understood, and only recently have we started to understand the functions of the brain, the auditory cortex, and in detail, and how this connects and the sensitive periods and all of that. These are things that they are in their infancy. But if you speak to someone about auditory processing problems, there's so much confusion about it. And even the diagnosis, there are no consistent rules on how to make the diagnosis. But at some point, with the increasing knowledge and understanding the nature of the critical periods, we will be able to see that a lot of these problems originated in early childhood, when the child didn't have enough auditory stimulation. And then they grow, and the problems with, middle ear infections and all of this will disappear. But the effect of that is going to continue. And you bring them to a specialist. Oh, they check their ears. Oh, they are fine. Their hearing is fine. But they have auditory processing problems. So people can't identify this because of the changing, developmental stages of the child. But a lot of that, what happens in the critical stages, is responsible for problems that we see in later stages. Neuroplasticity of the auditory system is not limited, as I mentioned, to childhood. Yes, it decreases as we grow. However, the auditory system is one of the most flexible systems, and it responds to stimulation, it responds to learning at any given period of time. So when adults, for example, receive specific auditory training, large-scale auditory reorganization of the auditory cortex occur. So that is a scientific fact, proven by a lot of studies. So just as an example, if you say you have someone and they hear a sound and they get a pinch. I mean, there's not that I am not speaking about something unethical, but let's just say you associate the sound with a punishment or with a reward. So you hear the sound and these immediately respond. So the more that you hear that sound, the more frequently that you hear the sound, the more frequently your auditory nerve is going to fire. And the more it fires, the more automatic, the more spontaneous, the more efficient it is going to respond. So the next time that you hear that tone, and immediately, like the doorbell, you hear it and you associate it with someone coming in, and immediately you just become immediately you process the signal so quickly, you remember who is coming, you remember, it basically makes, it activates your auditory system faster. So again, that can be induced. It can be someone who doesn't have that. They can go through the training and they can sharpen their auditory system significantly. So the bottom line is there was a lot of skepticism about auditory processing programs, auditory training programs. But what the skepticism was caused by was that many of these companies that developed these products did their own research initially. And of course, people become suspicious and they see bias. And when you do your own product, most likely, there's some kind of bias. So it took a few years when different independent organizations and researchers began conducting research on these auditory processing training programs. And indeed, they found that they are effective, like programs like Fast Forward, programs like Aerobics, Brain HQ. Again, I want to emphasize that I have no stake, no interest, no conflict of interest relating to any of these programs. I am just, speaking about research that shows how effective any number of these programs for auditory training can be. So they produce robust effects that are proven by the research. Now, also, implications for the auditory neuroplasticity is that, say, and that association, the example that I gave with a specific reward or punishment, for example, associating it with a sound that is going to reorganize the auditory cortex. Now, think about this. In your classroom, you have a child who comes, let's say, from Syria, a refugee. And that child was in an area where there was bombing and shelling every day. And I can tell you, this seems like something that, I mean, you think hypothetical, but I personally, almost every week, I meet some of these people and these children, and very interesting the experience when you see them and see how they behave and how they communicate and so on. You can see the shock that they are in. So someone like this sitting in the class, and then they hear a sound that you might think, oh, why did they react this way? Why did the child go crazy just hearing that sound? And you might think the child is misbehaving or whatever. And that child, you might think it's the sound of a rocket, the sound of a bullet, it's the sound of a door that kind of was making that noise when, for example, the government forces came to take his or her, his maybe father to kill him, or any kind of association. So these are things that we might kind of be unaware of, but just watch, for children. The same can be for a child who is abused, for example. The person, the abuser, follows a particular pattern. They open a door in a certain way, they make their feet make a certain kind of noise, and the kids associate that with the terror that they experience. And as they hear that sound, then they just start, to experience the fear. And one child in your class could hear a sound that is similar, and you might not be aware of why are they behaving this way? Why is the child going crazy when there's no reason? And the kids do not know how to explain and how to rationalize, and they might even engage in different behaviors, like this, kind of, for example, being angry, being agitated, being whatever, and then because we don't understand the background, we might say that the child is misbehaving, and it becomes a whole different thing. But we need to understand again our learners, and to be more in tune with their psychological needs, and understanding that some auditory signal can induce a certain fear response in a child or an adult that is going to change our perspective when the next time that we see that child or the adult. Vocal learning and vocal production. As I mentioned before, first, in order to produce language, you have to be exposed. You have to hear every sound of that language millions and millions of times. You have to hear words millions and millions of times. Every time you hear, you are going to have, the neurons will fire. And neurons in a certain circuit are going to follow a certain pattern of firing. So as a result, these pathways build memories of these sounds, memories of these words. And we know these memories, we call them mental representations of sounds, mental representations of words, or mental images sometimes. So in other words, in order for these mental representations and mental images of sounds and words to be mature, you have to make the circuit fire a certain number of times. And I'm speaking about millions and millions. And to remind you of the 30 million word gap project. That is, when you expect a child by age 3 years or so, that they should have heard They hear words. They hear 43 million words by that age. And if they don't hear enough, then anything below that is going to lead to problems. So children who actually show disabilities and they have deprivation, they hear 13 million words in 3 years. And that leaves them with that 30 million word gap where they haven't heard this, all this stimulation. That means that their nervous system didn't fire enough, for these sounds and these words. And that means that the system didn't connect well. So only with that adequate stimulation that we can form phonological memories, that we can form representations of the sounds and words. And when we have these and they are mature, we will use them as templates to activate the motor system to enable us to give speech, to produce speech, and to also activate the motor system so that we write, to express ourselves either on writing or verbally. So normal vocal learning and normal vocal production requires two things. Functional auditory system, that the system has to be functioning adequately from the beginning to the very end. And number two, adequate auditory stimulation. That, for example, as I mentioned, that the child who is 3 years old, they should have heard 43 million words. So if they hear only half of that, then that is not going to enable them to function well, to develop well. So the two things are not either or, it is both have to be present at the same time. What happens if there is no functional auditory system? What happens if the person is born with no hearing at all? Do you think they can develop language? Of course, verbal. No, impossible. What if they have perfect hearing and they have no exposure to speech at all? Do you think they will develop speech? Absolutely not. So in either case, these two conditions must be exactly there at the same time. And for the person to be able to develop sound and word representations that are mature enough to enable them to produce verbal language and written language. In humans, hearing serves two major functions when we speak about the development of vocal learning, being able to hear and build sound and phonemic and word representations here, and being able to express ourselves, use these as templates to express ourselves. So first, the auditory system serves as a channel for vocal learning. Again, building the phonological representations and the word representations. And we do that by also using imitation. The hearing, or when we hear all of this, it enables us to kind of imitate it, to use it as a template, to try to see if we can produce it. And that, we go through a period of time, imitate and kind of monitor ourselves. See how you say it and then listen to yourself. Say it and listen. So through auditory feedback, you correct the imitations that you produce and fine-tune them gradually over time. Fine-tune them gradually over time until your system becomes perfect and your language mimics that of the adults. The views of the past, when you would read about language development and how it does this, and Skinner says that and does that, these are obsolete views, and that view of Skinner, it is not scientific. At this time, we know more about the brain, and we do not really have to go back to 70 or, years back and look at 60 years back or 70 and say, oh, Skinner said, or that person said. So we know more now. And these views of Skinner and about how language develops, there are many, many problems with them. So interruption or lack of the feedback, that is going to disrupt the motor system, that is going to disrupt how we perceive sounds and how we produce sounds. Your ability to produce feedback. I mean, to monitor your hearing and to channel the feedback that you have to the parts of the brain, the higher parts of the cortex. There is a critical period for phonemic and linguistic learning. The period from birth to the seventh month, that period of time is marked by a very, very high level of neuroplasticity in the auditory system. And the whole brain, of course. But in terms of phonemic, or in terms of sound learning and linguistic learning, that is a critical stage. During this time, the child masters the sounds of his or her native language. They master the properties of these sounds. And they are able to distinguish between two different sounds of their language, and they are able to distinguish between various sounds in other languages. So at this point, they are like universal language learners. And between the 7th month and the 10th, or the beginning of the 11th month, the children, they start to kind of specialize. There's still the kind of tiny window of time that where they're still a little bit flexible, but once they hit the 11th month, then they start to tune out foreign languages. They start, their networks become specialized. They become dedicated to their native language. And as a result, they don't have energy to focus on other languages. They perceive other languages just as noises. And they become insensitive to phonemic differences in other languages. So that is one major landmark. The first year of life, the first 7 months are really, really, really critical. And we just feel so bad that many people do not understand the importance of these early months. And they do not spend enough time with the child, engaging the child in play and in sound, exposure to sounds and interactions and language. These are really, really critical, first few months. And I just, would hope that all of you make parents understand this, and so that they can give the children the auditory stimulation and all other kinds of sensory stimulation that they will need at this period of time. And when we speak about language learning, we speak mostly about the sentences you make, the words that you produce. We speak about the grammar and more about that. I added, by the way, a couple of images here. I hope they do not disorient you, but I added them to just facilitate, the discussion instead of having to go back and forth. So, in terms of the critical period for language learning the morphology, the syntax, the grammar, the kind of how to use language, it goes up to about 15 or so, just around early puberty. And that in puberty, we know that the nervous system starts to connect and to become more hardwired. And at this period of time, then the auditory system, the motor system becomes more rigid. And yes, the person can learn all aspects of language, and except for the accent, because the motor system is going to be more rigid. And if no matter how long they live in the country, for example, if they come here after age 15, most likely they will have an accent. Most likely. And the thing is that they do not have the ability to perceive here their accent. And many people say, no, I do not have an accent. But you, of course, as an independent listener, as a native speaker, are going to pick it. To identify it. But the other person cannot even identify it because they do not have solid mental representations of the sounds that enable them to distinguish between one sound and the other. I wanted to mention something about. So now we understand why foreign languages should be taught earlier. The earlier, the better. And a child can, up to 5-year-old, they can learn about 5 languages simultaneously at the same time. But given that each person has a number of adults who communicate with him or her in that language exclusively and systematically and consistently. So if you don't do that, then there will be a lot of confusion, and there will be that will actually cause more problems. I wanted to mention one thing about syntax. I'm sure all of you have studied Chomsky and studied his ideas about syntax. And these are taught in psychology courses and taught in language courses. Basically, Chomsky is the one credited with the idea of the term itself, syntax, which is grammar, and worked on it and made it into a science. One of the things that he was intrigued by was that the human brain has a center that is dedicated to syntax. And he said that he called that center the language learning device. And he proposed that the human being is born with that center, and in that center is preloaded with grammatical rules. And he spent a lot of time identifying universal rules among all languages in the world. For example, all languages have a hierarchical structure. They begin with a sound, and a set of sounds, the alphabet, and you build these alphabets into words. And then you put the words together to make sentences, and you make larger and larger entities with language. All of them have a hierarchical structure. All of them have a grammar, have morphology, have semantics, and all of this. So his idea was that a child would be born and his or her brain will be preloaded with these universal language forms. And when they go, say they are born in China, that universal code becomes modified, and it serves as the foundation for Chinese to develop as the child hears. A child is born in America, that foundation they already have and the preloaded grammar and stuff will serve as a foundation for them, and they develop it into American and so on. However, of course, you know, there was no such device discovered. I mean, the closest to it is Broca's area. That is the area that is dedicated to syntax and to motor activation. But how is syntax learned? It is learned in the same way like the brain learns anything. It is learned as a pattern. And when we say a pattern, it is something that is repeated over and over and over and over. In the same way, it is predictable. If I go like this, so immediately you are going to guess when I do this again that you hear this. And when I do this, immediately you are going to predict that I'm going to go. So the system, the pattern repeats itself over and over. The syntax, basically the grammar of the language, is a number of rules, a number of recipes for every kind of format. For every sentence has a recipe. And that recipe, for example, when we say the girl slept, that is a sentence. That's a recipe. The girl slept. You can look at the structure, the, and then girl, and then slept. You change the into a, but you still keep the same three windows. So a girl slept. Okay, keep this and change the middle here into from girl, say cat. A cat slept. Okay, take slept away and say walked. So a cat walked. So what we are doing, we kept the three windows the same in the same sequence. A first, cat second, and slept or walked or ran third. So that's a format, one sentence recipe. If you put a or the here, and you put a noun here, and the verb at the end, then you establish a kind of sentence format. And then you can empty this format and refill each window with a word that can fit and function here. Like here, any noun, anything that walks or talks or can do the job can fit in here. Say cat, boy, dog, lion, this. So you can change the meaning, but you keep the format the same. So now the important thing is that the format, when you use it in sequence, it will be a pattern like this, 3, like this. But if you have a different kind of format, the girl ate the apple, 5. Let's change. Say now a boy bought a book. So I changed. So the girl ate the apple into a boy bought a book. I didn't change the frame, but I changed the meaning. So these frames are fixed, and you refill and refill. You can make millions and billions of sentences using the same format. But what remains is that format, that pattern. So 5, you go 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 5. So that pattern, every time you fire it, you cause the pathways to fire. They will remember that pattern and associate it with these particular sounds and this particular sequence of the string of words. And now you have a syntactic rule stored in the brain. But the child is not born with it. It is what they hear frequently, these millions and millions of times. They cause the millions and billions of times of firing, and that makes the pathway, the circuit now remember that rule and will be able to use it as a format to activate your oral muscular systems so you can make the same reproduction, the same rule in words. So that is basically the brain learns by patterns. And this is why the traditional way of teaching grammar didn't work. You have people like, you develop a grammar book and say, okay, now the transitive verb comes here and goes there, and the subject is here, and the verb goes here, and the direct this, and the object goes. All of that stuff really it should come at the very end, after someone learns the rules of the language. Now, how do you teach syntax? This is what we do. In order to teach, say, a person a certain rule, the best way is to activate the brain using the same pattern of sentences, exchanging the meanings. You have activities like this. The girl ate the apple. And then have the child listen to as many sentences in that format as possible. Change the meaning frequently. Have the child make sentences similar within that format. Make them into into a table, like with blocks. Okay, now, tell me, what can we put here instead of the? It can be a. That's a controlled category, a or the. And here, girl, what can we put? Change, and frequently change. And so you keep making hundreds of sentences over a period of time using these same formats. And then now, at some point when the child is able to produce that independently, say, now let's see, compare this sentence with that sentence. What do we find in common between all of these, like 5 sentences here? What do you find in common? The child says, oh, I see all of them have the or a. Okay, now we understand here, that's the first requirement. How about this? Girl, boy, cat, this, that. What do they have in common? They are all nouns. They are all doers of some kind of action. So you say, oh, that is a subject. What we know. So you can understand now, when they taught us the grammar traditionally, they flipped the whole thing upside down. They gave you what you yourself would extract by learning these patterns, identifying them, and then looking back at them from a meta-linguistic perspective and say, oh, this is how it goes. So, but having the person listen and do interactions using these same formats of creating multiple sentences, many sentences following one structure, that is the best and the most effective and scientifically proven method of teaching grammar. Now, I wanted to also mention one thing. If someone has decreased exposure to grammar, like say someone who just moved to the States and or to another country and learning that language, and they haven't heard enough, their memory system is not as strong. Their memory for that language, if they give them you give them a memory test in that language, they show as having no memory basically. But that doesn't mean that their memory is bad. It means that their memory system hasn't been connected yet with the new language they are learning. And to prove that they indeed have a memory problem, you have to test them in the native language. And when you compare their performance in the native language and the new language, then you should be able to find, if they are normally functioning, that their native language should have normal memory, and the new language, it will have very decreased memory, depending on how long they have been exposed to the second language. So take this in consideration when you compare testing results, when you look at their performance on test scores and how long they have been exposed to the language, and so on. So the auditory system that experiences deprivation continues to be plastic for a longer time after the critical periods, and that is wonderful. That means that as long as the person does not receive the stimulation, they still present with auditory processing problems. Okay, so what is the solution? Is to give them the opportunity to develop that system through stimulation, either through continuously interacting and using certain kinds of phonemes and certain kinds of words and so on that you want to develop, or using some of these computer-based methods of stimulation that are commercially available. And these are programs. Someone could have a membership online, or they can contact a company and they get a set of CDs, or there are many ways they can access. But again, I'm not endorsing any particular program. I'm just telling you that research has shown that many of these programs that are really well developed, they have the research to back it up, and there are studies to show that they produce improvement. So lack of normal auditory experience leaves the brain open to be shaped by the appropriate input for a longer than usual period. And that explains why when you have a group of people who have normal hearing and a group of people who have problems with processing, and you expose them to the same program, auditory training program, the ones who have auditory processing problems, they are going to show more robust response. They will show greater improvement and greater change in their auditory system than the ones whose system is normal. The others too also show improvement, but not as robust, as strong as the ones who have auditory processing problems. And again, that explains to us why, because their system remains more flexible than the ones who have a normal auditory system. So this brings the auditory system to a close, and I hope again that you didn't mind me going through the basic anatomy, and I just wanted to give you a full view of things so you can put things in perspective. I hope that you think about a lot of strategies. I hope that you think about a lot of implications and how this knowledge that we have learned about the auditory system, how it connects, how does it make you understand better the students you have who have auditory problems, hearing loss, or conductive problems, middle ear infections, or other kinds of problems, and how they perform and function in the classroom, and in terms of generally all aspects of academics. We need to just think about applications, think about strategies. We gain this so that we can come up. And I can tell you, I can think about many of the strategies that I have discussed here, but you are experts in your areas. You are more in the classroom with the children. For example, you might be able to come with better recommendations and better strategies than the ones that I provide you, because frankly, for the past maybe 10 years, 11 or 12 years since I left the school system, I am not as fluent in terms of, the knowing children as well on an everyday basis, the children who have disabilities and so on, as you are in your jobs and your different roles in the schools. So thank you, and I hope we can have a nice, robust discussion and apply the materials and make the best of it. Thank you.